If you believe in the importance of independent journalism, we ask you to support the Brazilian Report. You can subscribe to our website in order to receive the best content about Brazil and Latin America in English. You can also go the extra mile and support us on Buy Me a Coffee. The platform allows you to buy a cup of coffee for our staff and to pledge monthly support to our newsroom. That allows us to expand our coverage, hire new reporters, improve our graphics and video content, and do special reporting that has already earned us multiple awards. In return, you get exclusive content, such as behind-the-scenes look into how we do things, and get your name on this podcast. Here are the people who have done their part in supporting independent journalism from Brazil. Mark Hillary, John Thomas III, Luiz Haynes, Erwan Menes, Orlando Black, Steve Knapp, Aaron Berger, James Coney, Kars Vresvik, Alasdair Townsend, Peter Abrahamson, Michael Fryer, Miller Renascido, Jim Awofedejo, David Dixon, Felipe Saito, José Rose Stankovic, Gabriela Graf Innes, Emerging Market Muser, Yarden Iftar, Tonica Thompson, Anderson da Silva, Kat Kramer, Fra, Peter Suffering, Anna Lund, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. If you cannot make a monthly commitment, you can still tip us a cup of coffee every now and then to give us the energy we need to cover a country as complex as Brazil and a region as complex as Latin America. We appreciate all your support. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more. When he returned to power, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was seen by traditional Brazilian allies, such as the European Union and the United States, as a man who would make Brazil an important world actor again. They expected him to break with Jair Bolsonaro's crass diplomatic ways and environmental lawlessness, which made Brazil something of an international pariah in recent years. 3 months, several statements, and a visit to China later, they may no longer be so sure.
É preciso que os Estados Unidos pare de incentivar a guerra e comece a falar em paz. É preciso que a União Europeia comece a falar em paz, para a gente poder convencer o Putin e o Zelensky de que a paz interessa a todo mundo.
My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. This is Explaining Brazil. During Lula's first rodeo in the presidency between 2003 and 2010, he led what was called back then an active and upstanding diplomacy. It meant not seeing Brazil as a peripheral actor on the global stage and fighting for a more egalitarian balance of power in international relations. Lula defended a world order that was not so U.S. centric and invested heavily in South-South relations. Back in power for a third term, Lula still defends the same principles, but geopolitical conditions differ from his first time in office. A U.S. China decoupling and the war in Ukraine make it much harder for countries to navigate between global superpowers in a position of total neutrality, with which Brazil was always comfortable. That is particularly the case if a president is continuously throwing jabs. Last week, Lula traveled to Shanghai and Beijing in order to rekindle Brazil-China relations. He signed 15 trade agreements, but the focus was not on how bilateral trade and investments can be improved. Instead, international observers were flabbergasted by some of Lula's geopolitical remarks.
Because the war started just by the decisions made by 2 countries.
E agora, o que nós estamos tentando construir?
What are we trying trying to build
Nós
now.
estamos tentando construir um grupo de países
We're trying to form a group of countries
que não tem nenhum envolvimento com a guerra,
that has no kind whatsoever involvement with the war,
que não querem a guerra,
that do not want the war to
que
continue,
desejam construir paz no mundo,
that want to build peace in the world,
para conversarmos tanto com a Rússia quanto com a Ucrânia.
and we should talk together and with Russia.
It was one of those trips that normally allow presidents to announce lots of positive news on the economic front. What is remarkable, though, is how much Lula's comments contaminated the positive narrative his government sought to establish. It is fair to say that if Lula had spoken less about Ukraine during the trip to China, the bottom line of the trip would have been one of diplomatic and economic restoration. And if that wasn't enough, the Brazilian government hosted Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who initiated in Brazil a Latin America tour to 3 other countries that are allied with the Kremlin and known for being ruled by authoritarian regimes: Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. We welcome back to the show Cede Silva, our Brasilia correspondent, to talk about Lula's foreign policy. Cede covered Lavrov's visit to Brasilia up close. Cede, welcome back.
Thank you, Gustavo.
Before we dwell on the current controversies involving Lula, Cede, can you tell us a little bit about his position on the war in Ukraine? He has spoken on the issue since before the 2022 presidential election.
Yes, so Lula does in foreign policy the same thing that he does on domestic policy, in that he speaks different things to different audiences. So during the elections, Lula gave an interview to Time magazine, and he explicitly said that Zelensky had chosen war. And he also blamed the United States and the European Union for not promising Russia that Ukraine would never join NATO. So Lula was echoing a Russian talking point in that Russia was afraid that one day Ukraine would join NATO, that one day NATO would get closer, even closer to Russia's borders. And for this reason, they needed to thwart this threat. So this is what Lula said during the elections. But then in February this year, Lula visited U.S. President Joe Biden at the White House. And before this visit, he was at the Blair House, which is the visitor's house for people who are going to visit the White House. And in the Blair House, Lula gave an interview to CNN International, to Christiane Amanpour. And then he said a different thing. He said that the Russian invasion was a historical mistake. So Lula has a habit of saying different things to different audiences. And with Ukraine, it's the same thing.
I mean, and Lula spoke with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on video, right? And I remember a piece you wrote explaining that if you just had the Brazilian reading of the conversation, it would have seemed a very different conversation from the readings from the Ukrainian government.
Yes, so Presidents Lula and Zelensky spoke by video chat a few weeks ago, and they came away with very different summaries or descriptions of what the conversation was about. So on social media at least, Zelensky highlighted the importance of Ukraine's territory and sovereignty and territorial integrity. And Lula was just like, oh, we need peace. Countries should not want war, and we should make any initiative for peace. But he was not addressing the main problem of the war, the main casus belli, which is Ukraine's territorial integrity.
Right, and I mean, we are still talking about Lula in Ukraine. What did the Brazilian president say this time around?
Okay, so Lula was going back from China. He was at the United Arab Emirates this time, and he said that the war was an option or a decision by 2 countries. So he once again tried to place Ukraine and Russia on the same level.
Foi mais fácil do que será a saída da guerra.
I think it was easier to get into war than to get out of war.
Like, this is a war that was a decision by both countries. which got a lot of backlash because very clearly Russia is an invader. Russia invaded Ukraine, so it was not a decision by both countries. There's one country that invaded and the other that is an invader, and they're fighting to survive.
The reaction was pretty quick and harsh, right? The US said he was, quote, parroting Russian and Chinese propaganda, and the EU said he was dead wrong in saying that both the aggressor and the country that had its sovereignty attacked are equally to blame for the war. I mean, that's not great for a country that wants to be seen as a peacemaker and a mediator between the two sides of this conflict, right?
Yes, this is the reason why, unlike most foreign analysts, I believe, unlike most people who are analyzing in the Brazilian press, I do not trust Lula's sincerity in wanting to be a peacemaker. Lula's supposed plan for a proposal is just too close to Russia, and it has been complemented by the Russian government more than one time. So the Russian government has welcomed Lula's supposed peace plan and Lula's supposed intentions more than once, while the Ukraine government has never done the same, which, in my understanding, Lula is not really wanting to be a peacemaker and mediator. He wants to stand as relevant, wants Brazil to be a relevant country offering its services in this conflict, but it doesn't really want to be a mediator because it is really too close to the Russian side to play that role.
So, Sede, you were at the Foreign Affairs Ministry when Sergei Lavrov met his Brazilian counterpart, Mauro Vieira. Let's remember that Celso Amorim, who is Lula's top foreign policy advisor and one of the few people Lula really trusts and listens to, had already gone to Moscow on a very hush-hush trip. What was the bottom line of Lavrov's talk with Vieira?
Okay, so one of the things that people should understand, and as you said, I was there at the foreign ministry in Brazil, there was no opportunity for the press to ask any questions. It was just an announcement. So ministers Mauro Vieira and Sergei Lavrov, they went to the microphone, they said what they wanted to say, and then they left. And that there was a lot of press, including Russian press there as well, but we were not allowed to ask any questions. So we were left with what they wanted to say. There's the possibility that there are some things that they talked about they did not say to the press, but we could not ask any questions. So we are left with what they said. Basically, they said that the economic relations, the trade relations between Brazil and Russia have been growing steadily over the last few years, and that Russia and Brazil have a close partnership. Russia provides fertilizers to Brazil. Russia is our main fertilizer supplier, and that there are opportunities for Brazil and Russia to cooperate further on space exploration and even on nuclear energy. And there is a goal of $10 billion yearly in foreign trade that they want to reach soon. We are already in $9 billion in trade between Brazil and Russia per year, and now they want to make that up to $10 billion. So it was basically an effort to portray the Brazil-Russia relationship as an important relationship, as a key relationship between both countries, and as basically a normal relation apart from the war. And then Lavrov, when he was making his pronouncement, Lavrov said that Brazil and Russia share, quote-unquote, similar approaches in geopolitics because both are in favor of a multipolar world order. And this goes in line with Lula's recent trip to China and Lula saying about not using the dollar in a trade between the BRICS countries. Brazil already has an early agreement with China for both countries not to use the dollar in Brazil-China trade, and Lula wants to expand that. all towards a direction of this multipolar world order, where the dollar is less relevant, where the United States is less relevant, and where multipolar South-South cooperation, such as BRICS, the New Development Bank, G77, UNASUR, and these other organizations are more relevant than they used to be.
Now, you were talking about Lula's statement on relying less on the dollar, and that immediately reminded me of a piece you wrote for our premium newsletter about a recent agreement between the central banks of China and Brazil that will help to reduce exchange rate risk and boost the clout of the yuan. The agreement was signed on January 31st and announced a few weeks later. And under its terms, China would nominate an offshore clearing bank operating in Brazil to act as a sort of representative of China's central bank that would facilitate transactions in yuans.
Yeah, the agreement has already been signed. China already has similar agreements, including with European countries, which is good for business, really, when you're exchanging and signing contracts exclusively on two currencies. It means, as you said, that you expose yourself less to the risk of the dollar gaining or losing value, and then you needing to spend more or less than the amount of money that was agreed on the contract. And what Lula is now proposing, and could take some time, but what he is proposing is that a similar agreement as the one that has already been signed between Brazil and China could also be signed between the BRICS countries, and that trade between the BRICS would not use the dollar as an intermediary currency. Russia is among Brazil's top 20 business partners. We import, of course, a lot of fertilizers from Russia. So this could make a dent on the importance of the dollar and could also improve trade as the exchange risk with the dollar is removed from the question.
No, so the diplomacy is made of symbols, right? Does the fact that Lavrov came to Brazil just before going to Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, countries that have cozied up to the Kremlin, do you see any significance in his itinerary, or am I reading too much into it?
I think it's clear that at this moment, Russia and Lavrov, they're not picking extra fights, that they're going to the friendly governments, they're going to places where they will have a friendlier situation. At the Foreign Affairs Ministry, for example, it was very clear in the press announcement that they were not going to allow reporters to ask any questions. They were not taking risks. Everything was going to be done in a very organized environment. And it was not clear until very late in the afternoon whether or not Lavrov would meet with President Lula as well. So by not going, for example, to Chile, which has a President Gabriel Boric, which besides him, despite him being left-wing, he is very critical of the authoritarian left. It is a choice that Russia is saying, we're not picking any extra fights. We're going to the friendly countries such as Brazil's Lula, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, and we're not going to a place that we might have any controversy or where the government might be a little more critical of us.
Now, going back to your point that you do not believe Lula really wants to be a peacemaker, we reported during the 2022 campaign that Lula's views on the conflict shocked EU diplomats. One source told us that the sit-down with Lula was an extraordinary 4-hour meeting, but that the ambassadors expressed surprise that Lula and his team seemed, quote, misinformed on many aspects of the war. And when one ambassador mentioned the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea, the former Foreign Affairs Minister Celso Amorim corrected the diplomat and pointedly stated that Russia had invaded Crimea and not Ukraine. I mean, what are the risks for Lula and for Brazil of voicing this kind of opinion?
I think the risk is is already very calculated. It's already factored in, which is the risk of Brazil being seen as picking sides. That in the Russia-Ukraine war, Brazil poses as a neutral actor, but it actually leans heavily towards Russia. And I think it's a risk that Brazil is very willing to take, that the Lula administration is very willing to take by hosting Lavrov very publicly here in Brasilia before they host Dmitry Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, by having Celso Amorim visit Moscow first and not visiting Ukraine, by having Celso Amorim saying in an interview very cynically, my understanding, that Moscow doesn't even look like it's a country in war, which of course, because Russia is the invading country, not the invader, not the invaded. And I don't think it should be a surprise for those European diplomats. It comes to me a surprise that they were surprised by that. But it's very clear that by all that is happening, after a first quarter in the year where Brazil hosted a lot of top-level U.S. diplomats and U.S. authorities and authorities in the government, and including, of course, Lula's visit to Joe Biden, it is now very clear that Lula and Brazil are very comfortable in picking a side and in being much closer to Russia than they are to Ukraine in this conflict.
When talking about domestic politics, many say Lula acts and thinks as if Brazil still worked as it did in the 2000s when he was first president. Do you think Lula's moves on Ukraine indicate he also sees the world without taking into account the massive changes it has undergone since he left office in 2010?
Yeah, I understand that Lula does see that the world has changed, and this, if anything, has actually provided extra stimulation for him to double down on the foreign policy that was in practice during Lula's first spell as president from 23 to 2010, because at that time there was a lot of talk, and I also was a BA in international relations, so I went to international relations college at that time, and there was a lot of articles about the growth of China, and China is getting bigger, and the dragon is appearing, and et cetera, and a lot of covers in the Economist magazine about how China was going to take over and China was going to be a large superpower. And the fact is now China is stronger than it was at that time. China is bolder. China is making move towards Taiwan that it wouldn't make 20 years ago. China has developed further the Belt and Road Initiative. China was able to elect the Director General of the World Health Organization, Margaret Chan, and then also her successor, Tedros Adhanom, the current director, was also from Ethiopia. His candidacy was also sponsored by China. So China's international clout is larger than it was before. And also, back at that time, back in Lula's first spell as president, early on, BRICS was just an acronym made by a Goldman Sachs analyst. And now BRICS is a real bloc that makes meetings every day. It has a real bank in Shanghai. And now President Dilma Rousseff leads that bank. And so, if anything, Lula is now bolder and more confident in having and picking a preference for Russia and China and third world countries as Brazil's main allies, because if anything, the balance of power has shifted in favor of those countries in relation to 20 years ago.
So depending on how things unfold, Lula will either be a visionary that put Brazil ahead of the curve or a delusional president that made huge blunders, right?
Yeah, it's a very good discussion whether or not Brazil could extract more from countries by having a more balanced view, which is something that the Itamaraty, Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has always sold this perspective that it's better. What I say, not Itamaraty, but what I say is that it's better if Brazil behaves like the child of divorced parents. Like if you're not very close either to mom or to dad, you can extract from the jealousy between mom and dad more extractions and more concessions. But the problem is, especially during Lula's time, this was never true. Brazil was never this child with not a favorite parent. It always had China and Russia as its preferred friend and its closer friends, and it has always distrusted the United States. Whether there's a Democrat or a Republican in government, Brazil has always been much more critical of the U.S. than it is of either China or Russia.
And internally, Sede, what have been the effects, if any, of these kind of diplomatic moves by Lula?
Yeah, I see a lot of backlash in the press. I see a lot of backlash from analysts, from opinion people, from people with op-eds and so on. But I do not see the same backlash in the actual opposition. And one of the problems, or one of the reasons for that, Gustavo, is because the opposition, who is very closely linked yet to former President Jair Bolsonaro, they do not have much to say on this topic because Bolsonaro himself was also very close to Russia. Bolsonaro visited Moscow a few days before the full-fledged invasion on February 2022. Bolsonaro was not critical of the invasion, and Bolsonaro tried to justify his position in that Brazil's agriculture is very dependent on Russian fertilizer, and so it would be better for Brazil not to hinder Russia. Brazil did not join any sanctions against Russia, and so the opposition cannot criticize Lula a lot because they're close to Bolsonaro, which had a very similar position. I would say that the only difference was that Bolsonaro was not as eager to repeat the same Russian talking points. He was just neutral and mostly silent on the matter. He would not criticize the invasion, but he would not defend it either. Where Lula is much more eager and willing to say that the war is also to blame on Ukraine or on NATO, or that there is a peace and people should be engaging in a peace without any preconditions, which in a very concrete way legitimizes the Russian invasion. Because if you're going to have peace talks without the Russians being removed first, then we're going to talk with Russian soldiers and Russian tanks inside Ukraine.
Sede Silva is our Brasilia correspondent. Sede, thank you very much, and I hope to have you back on the show very soon.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, and thank you for having me.
If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It takes only a second, and it will help us reach a wider audience. Or better yet, sign up for the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. Thanks to our subscribers, we have been able to cover Brazil and Latin America extensively, and for that work, we have won or been shortlisted for multiple international awards. More recently, our expose about the rise of hunger in Brazil was selected by the True Story Award as one of the world's top 94 stories of 2022. In order to keep doing that work, we need your support. Go to Brazilian.com/subscribe. I'm Gustavo Ribeiro. Thanks for listening. Explaining Brazil will be back next week.